everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're tackling something that might sound a little intimidating at first. Code units. In AL programming for Business Central. I know code can seem like a whole other language to some folks, but stick with us. We're going to break it down so you can really understand how customizations are built, even if you're not the one writing the code. Think of it like peeking behind the curtain of Business Central. And to help us out, we've got a great YouTube tutorial from Grom's Tech Talks to guide us along the way.
You know, what I think is really interesting is that even if you don't plan on becoming an AL programmer yourself, understanding code units gives you a much deeper appreciation for how Business Central works under the hood.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is a code unit?
So a code unit you can think of essentially like a container for code, kind of like a toolbox, you might say, but full of specialized tools, or in this case, procedures. Each one of these procedures within the code unit is designed to perform a specific task in Business Central.
Okay, so if I need Business Central to do something very specific, there's probably a code unit out there with a procedure for that.
Exactly. The tutorial that we're looking at uses a simple example of a code unit that adds two numbers together. And you might be surprised that even such a simple action requires its own dedicated code.
That makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
So how's a code unit structured? Like, what are the key elements that make it up?
Well, just like any toolbox, a code unit needs to be organized. So first off, you have the ID and name, which is basically like a label for your code unit. Then we have what's called a trigger. And this is what determines what activates the code unit.
So the trigger is like what sets the whole thing in motion, kind of like opening the toolbox.
Exactly. And next up, we have variables. Now these, think of them as placeholders for the data that's being used by the code unit. So in our addition example, the variables would hold, or you could say store, the two numbers that we want to add together.
Oh, okay. So you need a place to put those numbers before you can add them together. What about the actual calculation? How does that happen?
Ah, well, that's where procedures come into play. They contain the step-by-step instructions for whatever task the code unit needs to perform. Kind of like the specific tool you'd grab from your toolbox, in this case, in the tutorial's example. There's a procedure that specifically tells Business Central exactly how to add those two numbers together.
So it's almost like the add function on a calculator is really a procedure within a code unit.
Yeah, it's a really good way to think about it. The tutorial even shows the AL code for this simple example, so you can actually see, you know, how these elements all fit together. You've got your variables defined, the procedure written out step by step, and the trigger that kicks everything off.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all the pieces fit together. So we've got our code unit all set up, but how does it actually get used within Business Central? Like, how does it actually interact with what the users are seeing and doing?
And this is where the tutorial's demonstration is really helpful, because they show how this code unit can be called into action. From a simple page in Business Central, so just imagine you're clicking a button on a page. Well, that click can act as the trigger to activate the add procedure in our code unit.
Whoa, so something as simple as clicking a button can actually trigger this whole chain of events in the code.
Yeah, precisely. Okay. And this is really where things start to get interesting, because it highlights how code units can act as this bridge between what the user sees, you know, clicking that button, and all this complex logic that's happening behind the scenes. So picture this. You click the add button. Behind the scenes, that click triggers the code unit. The add procedure grabs the numbers from those variables we talked about, performs a calculation, and then sends the result back to the user. And really, that's just scratching the surface of what code units can do.
Wow, okay. This is blowing my mind. I think we need to dig into this a little bit more.
Yeah, it really is fascinating how much is going on behind the scenes, right? And, you know, this example we've been looking at, the one that just adds two numbers together.
Yeah.
It's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to code units. They're used for all sorts of things in Business Central. I mean, way more complex than just simple arithmetic.
Okay, so we've got the basics down, but I'm curious, what are some real-world examples of how these code units are actually used? Like, what kind of tasks can they automate?
Well, think about all the different things that businesses do in Business Central. You know, managing inventory, tracking sales, processing orders, handling financials. Code units can be programmed to automate tasks within pretty much all of those areas. And a lot more.
Okay. So if I needed Business Central to, I don't know, automatically generate a sales report every week, or maybe send out reminder emails for overdue invoices, could I use a code unit for that?
Exactly. You could have a code unit that scans for overdue invoices every day and then automatically triggers the process of sending out those reminder emails.
Yeah.
Or let's say you need to integrate Business Central with your e-commerce platform. A code unit could handle the transfer of data, like new orders from the website directly into Business Central.
Wow. It really sounds like code units are kind of the backbone of making Business Central adaptable to all these different specific business needs. This is really giving me a whole new perspective on how powerful Business Central can be.
It is powerful. And, we've only been talking about one type of code unit so far, code units that contain what we call business logic. But there are actually different types of code units, each with their own specific purpose.
Yeah, hold on. Different types. Okay, I need to hear more about this.
So, for example, you have something called test code units. Now, these are specifically designed for testing the functionality of other code units, which helps developers make sure that everything is working as it should. You can kind of think of them as quality control for your code.
That makes a lot of sense. So there's a whole system in place to make sure that these code units are reliable and doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. And then you have code units that handle integration with external systems. So these are really crucial for connecting Business Central to other applications that you might be using, like your CRM system or your warehouse management system. And they're also code units that are specifically focused on UI elements. So they help customize the look and feel of the pages within Business Central.
Okay, so it's not just about automating tasks. Code units are also responsible for how Business Central interacts with other systems and even how the interface itself is designed.
You got it. And, this is where understanding code units can give you a real advantage, even if you're not a programmer yourself.
Yeah.
Just knowing that these different types exist and having a basic understanding of what their roles are can help you see the bigger picture of how Business Central is customized and tailored to meet very specific needs.
It never ceases to amaze me how much complexity there is beneath the surface of something that we use every day. It's like we're seeing a whole new dimension of Business Central.
And we're just talking about the types of code units themselves. We haven't even touched on how they can be used to react to specific events that happen within Business Central.
Okay, now you're really making me curious. What do you mean by code units reacting to events?
So imagine this. You want a notification to pop up whenever a new sales order is created in the system. Well, you can actually program a code unit to basically listen for that specific event, the creation of that new sales order, and then trigger a specific action, like displaying that notification.
So the code unit's like constantly on alert, waiting for a specific trigger to happen.
Exactly. And this is all done using something called event subscribers, which basically tell the code unit, hey, pay attention to these specific events happening in Business Central. It's a really powerful way to make your customizations more dynamic and responsive to what's going on in the system.
That's fascinating. So we have all these different types of code units, each with their own specific purpose. And then we can layer on this event-driven functionality to make them even more powerful. It really opens up a world of possibilities.
It really does. And the more you learn about code units, the more you start to see the potential for automating tasks, integrating systems, and really customizing Business Central to fit your exact needs.
I've got to say, this deep dive is really living up to its name, but I have to admit, this is a lot to take in. What's the one key takeaway that our listeners should really keep in mind about code units? If they only remember one thing from this whole conversation, what should it be?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Code units are really the engines that drive a lot of the custom functionality that you experience in Business Central. They're the workers behind the scenes that are making things happen the way you need them to. And even if you don't write the code yourself, understanding what code units are and how they work gives you a much deeper understanding of the system as a whole.
That's a great point. I'm already starting to see things a little differently. It's like I've got a secret decoder ring for Business Central now. It really is. Like we've gotten this backstage pass to see how the whole show comes together, And it's funny, when you first mentioned code units, I have to admit, I was a little intimidated. I thought this whole deep dive was going to be all this complicated code and technical jargon.
Yeah.
But you've actually done a really great job of explaining it in a way that makes sense, even for someone like me, who's not a developer.
Well, that's the goal, right? To try to make this information accessible and understandable, regardless of your technical background. Because at the end of the day, code units are just tools. And like any tool, they're way more powerful when you actually understand how to use them.
Absolutely. So for our listeners out there who are feeling inspired and maybe want to learn a little bit more about code units, what would you recommend? Where should they go from here?
Well, if you're ready to kind of roll up your sleeves and get a little more hands-on, I definitely recommend checking out the Microsoft Docs website. They've got a ton of great resources on there, specifically for AL programming in Business Central. You can find tutorials, code samples,
Yeah.
and really detailed documentation on all aspects of code unit development.
Okay, so that sounds like a great starting point. Is there anything else they should kind of keep in mind as they start exploring this a little bit further?
One thing I always tell people is don't be afraid to experiment. Code units are a great way to learn by doing. So, start with some simple examples like that addition code unit that we discussed from the tutorial, and just try modifying the code. See what happens. Play around with different variables, different procedures, different triggers. The more you experiment, the more comfortable you become with all the concepts.
That's great advice. Like learning anything new, the best way to understand it is to jump in and give it a try. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge. Think about a task that you do regularly in Business Central, something that maybe takes up a bit of your time or feels a little bit repetitive. Now try to imagine how Code Unit might be able to automate that task for you.
Yeah. It's a really fun exercise trying to think like a developer. Could you create a code unit to automatically generate that report that you need every week? Or maybe streamline a particular data entry process. You might be surprised at the possibilities that open up when you start thinking about how code units can be applied to your specific needs.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire some of our listeners out there to become AL programmers themselves. The world of Business Central customization is waiting to be explored. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic structure of code units to all the different types, and even how they can react to events within Business Central. I hope this deep dive has given you a whole new appreciation for the power and flexibility that code units bring to Business Central. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Another deep dive into the world of Business Central.